We've all been there, haven't we? You're playing a game of Monopoly where one player is clearly dominant. They got a Monopoly before anyone else was able to, they've jacked up their rents with houses and hotels, and own twice as much property as anyone else. The game is effectively over. And yet, it might not be officially over for another couple hours. If you're one of the losing players, this impending doom which you're mostly powerless to stand against can be quite disheartening, and negatively color your perception of the latter part of the game. This is likely not the note any designer wants their game to end on, especially when considering the fact that if your game is played by a group of 4 players, then it's possible that 75% of the players will feel this way towards the end. But the final stretch of our Monopoly example isn't actually all that fun for the winning player either. There might be some catharsis of bankrupting your friends, but ultimately playing through the conclusion of the game you've already effectively won can end up being quite dull. Today we're going to look at several video games, board games, and even a sport to pick apart the various methods they use to make their finales just quite simply way better than what you get in that Monopoly finale. To make them more interesting, more competitive, more exciting, more enthralling. So come along, viewers, as we discover together how you can make losing, or even just more broadly, the end of your game, fun. Method 1. Just let the players give up. We first turn to the world of chess, a game where it's possible to end up in positions where one player, if they play perfectly, can guarantee a checkmate something like 8, 9, or perhaps even more moves out from the current board state. But even ignoring that, just one bad move, like one where you lose a powerful piece like your queen needlessly, can effectively kill your hopes of winning right then and there. As such, you'd expect chess would be a terrible example for us to use. But that neglects the fact that chess is a game where it is, especially at the higher levels of play, very much socially acceptable to resign from the game when you feel that you're at a disadvantage so great that you don't think you can overcome it. Admittedly, this method is a bit of a cop-out, and is harder to implement satisfactorily in a game involving more than 2 players. But hey, it at least beats playing through some of those particularly long and arduous Monopoly endgames, doesn't it? Method 2. Just make your game hard. The issues with the Monopoly example do not end at the mere fact that one player can end up with such an advantage that if they play properly, they're almost guaranteed to win. There's also the fact that in Monopoly, shepherding your sizable advantage into a win is an almost brain-dead simple process. This not only makes the act of playing through your win a dull experience in and of itself, it also removes any thought from the losing players' minds that you could mess it up, thus draining them of their hope to make a comeback. One fix you can employ is just making your game really difficult so that, at least at lower levels, a sizable advantage doesn't necessarily translate into a foregone conclusion of victory. Chess is actually a good example of this method as well. Yes, you can get into positions where a checkmate can be guaranteed 8 moves out, but that's generally with the caveat that perfect play is required to guarantee that win. And chess is such a deep, complex game that most people don't possess the skills to guarantee that perfect play. Another example I can draw from is bowling. Technically, if after the first frame you got a strike while your opponent got a spare, then congratulations, you are mathematically guaranteed to win the game. If you play perfectly from then on. Which again is something that most casual bowlers cannot consistently achieve. Now, one drawback of this approach is it becomes less effective the more skilled your players are. Sure, low elo chess players might take turns making what effectively should be losing moves, and thus the advantage shifts back and forth like a wild roller coaster. But a grandmaster can take even a small advantage and play it through to a favorable outcome. Although let's be honest, more often it's a draw, but that's just because chess is such a well-balanced game. Likewise, if you're bowling with someone who only misses the strike 1% of the time, then you're probably not going to come back once you're behind. The other issue with this approach is it does very much take agency away from the losing players. Yes, they have to play well to have a chance, but ultimately their fate is decided based on whether or not their opponent messes up, which can be disheartening in its own way. Method 3. Just roll the dice. Now we enter into Mario Party's wheelhouse. The way Mario Party keeps players from feeling hopeless towards the end of a losing game is with copious amounts of luck. Don't worry if you're down a couple stars in the final stretch. A chance time can fix that for you in a jiffy. Have you lost nearly all of the minigames up to this point, and therefore are broke? Not to worry, a Bowser Revolution or luck-based battle minigame will lift you right back on your feet. Basically, it's difficult to wallow in hopelessness and misery when the next turn could very possibly bring about a complete reversal of fortunes. Unfortunately, RNG is not an immediate guarantor of a good multiplayer game. In fact, it introduces about as many problems as it solves. Firstly, unless you're poker, you can basically just write off the idea of people taking your game seriously as a test of skill. But also, losing because the game effectively arbitrarily decided to screw you over is not exactly the best feeling experience in the world. Now obviously, not everyone goes into a state of rage when they lose at Mario Party, but often that's because the very nature of it being such a luck-based game can cause players to check out from it and not really care about the outcome that much. Which isn't bad necessarily. In fact, it can prove a great background for hanging out with friends, but it might not be what your game is going for. So RNG can be useful, but tread lightly. Method 4. Just make your game short. A Mario Kart race typically takes about 3 minutes to complete. If you're in last place going into the final lap, you're probably not going to win. However, does it really matter that much when the game's going to be over in a minute anyway? I'd argue no. Of course, not all designs lend themselves to being so short, and some gamers are specifically looking for a game that'll occupy them for a couple hours. But if your game is only a few minutes long, it does help to stop players from wallowing in their inevitable demises. Method 5. Just hide who's winning. Now, one thing to be noted is that the issue we're fighting for here is a mental one. An issue of mindset. There's a question to be asked as to whether or not a player is truly losing if that same player is unaware that they are in fact losing. Well, factually, yes, of course they are losing, but what we actually care about is the mindset. And to that question, probably not. What can make the endgame of Monopoly a boring slog is the inevitability of it all. If somehow you didn't know who was winning, then problem solved, right? Well, kinda. In Small World, players keep their victory coins hidden until the very end of the game. Technically, you could try to keep track in your head as to exactly how many coins each player has, but let's be honest, you're not going to do that because it's not fun and it expends way too much mental energy. Presuming you're not keeping a running total in your head, then not knowing who exactly is winning and just how far behind them you are helps to keep hopelessness from setting in. Ticket to Ride takes a slightly different approach to the same method. Instead of hiding your score, Ticket to Ride gives each player their own secret objectives. If you fulfill them, you gain points at the end of the game. If you don't, then you lose points. You might have some idea as to how well you're doing, but until you see your opponent's routes and whether or not they completed them, you really can't guess with much accuracy at who is actually going to win. Of course, not all designs really have a compelling way to make their scoring elements hidden like this. Good luck hiding who's doing well in a strategy game built on expanding your empire through conquest. But, if you can make it fit, hidden scoring information is not a bad idea, and can nip this issue right in the bud. Method 6. Just let the players gang up on the leader. We've already gone over how hiding who's winning can help to make the game more interesting in the final stretch, but having the leading player be abundantly clear can also work just as well, with two caveats. Firstly, it should be a game for more than 2 players, and secondly, the players have to be able to do something to harm the leader. In Catan, it's pretty easy to know who's in the lead. Most of the points you score in the game are based on public information. As well, you can get a pretty obvious feel as to whose economies are working wonderfully, and who is struggling to expand their colony at all, just based on how many resources people are getting. But here's the fun part. If one player is obviously pulling ahead, then the other players will often stop trading with them, or at the very least strong-arm them into less favorable terms, thus giving everyone else a chance to catch up. Another example could be Smash Brothers, specifically its stock mode. Players here very much do have the ability to form small truces with each other to try and work together to take down a player that's been wiping the floor with everyone else, or just hiding in the corner biding their time. I mean, I won't judge. Now, the issue with relying on this approach is the fact that it relies on your players to effectively balance your game for you in real time. Many, perhaps most groups of players will behave in this manner where they gang up on anyone that pulls too far ahead. But certainly not all groups will. There are some groups where, say, a husband and wife are playing against some friends and that bond is, in that case, very much inseparable at times. Or maybe just one player hates another player at the table and is going to destroy their game regardless of whether or not it makes sense from a game theory perspective. In those kinds of cases, this sort of game's endgame could end up feeling a lot like Monopoly's. Additionally, even when your player psychology is working as intended, you may still create undesirable outcomes. It's possible that victory in your game might become more about flying under the radar or manipulating your opponents with a silver tongue than, actually being good at the mechanics of your game. Now, if you're making diplomacy, that's probably what you're going for. But for Smash Brothers, probably not so much. Method 7. Just add negative feedback loops, or at least avoid positive ones. One of the things that can magnify the issues of the Monopoly endgame is the fact that Monopoly is a game where success begets more success. It's a classic positive feedback loop. Someone lands on your property, giving you more money, which lets you buy or trade for more properties, which makes people landing on your properties more likely, which pushes more money in your direction, which lets you upgrade your properties, which means you get even more money when people land on them, which gives you more money, and so on. The issue with positive feedback loops is that they make it actively more difficult to catch up to someone once they have established a lead. It can magnify even very slight and small advantages over time. That, of course, can lead to the game feeling lost for the losing players earlier than would be the case had a positive feedback loop not been present. A negative feedback loop is the opposite. It makes something more difficult the more you've already done it. An obvious example of a negative feedback loop would be Mario Kart, where the better your placement in the race, the worse the items you get. In theory, that's a great negative feedback loop, though in practice it often doesn't end up working out quite so smoothly. This is because in Mario Kart, many of the items in the game harm the players immediately around you. So yes, if you're in the bottom half of the pack, you'll get stronger items than you would if you were in the top half, but you'll also be getting hit by stronger items, so it can often actually be a bit of a wash. Though if the game only included, say for example, speed boosting items like the mushrooms, then it would be a much more clean-cut example of a negative feedback loop. Of course, many designs are sort of by their nature positive feedback loops. Almost any game where what you primarily do in it is build an economy is likely to be at its heart a positive feedback loop. But even if a significant portion of your design is in effect a positive feedback loop, you can add some negative feedback loops in there to hopefully blunt your positive feedback loop a bit. In Europa Universalis, the unrest and institution mechanics do just that. Yes, having a larger empire gives you more money, which lets you field larger armies and the like, but conquering a vast empire is far from a walk in the park when you find yourself having to put down rebellions on the regular, and when spreading new technological innovations through such a vast state proves much more expensive than it would be for a more compact country. So yeah, negative feedback loops, they're useful, they feel less arbitrary than randomness, and it's almost more fair to have them than not, since in theory the players who are winning are presumably better at the game and therefore should be able to handle the challenge that a negative feedback loop provides. They can be a bit unsatisfying to interact with, though. People generally like getting stronger over time, so do be aware of that. Method 8. Just make them laugh. The Jackbox Party Packs are in theory about competing with your friends to try to win various humorous games. But really they're about the laughs you have along the way. Many party card games follow a similar design philosophy. Basically, if people are too distracted laughing at your game, they won't have much extra brain cells to spend on lamenting how hopelessly far behind they are. That's of course not to say that none of these sorts of games employ any of the other mitigation methods. Like Method 9. Just make the later rounds worth more points. It's a simple way to go about it, but if say for example round 1 of your game is worth 1 point to win, and then round 2 is worth 2 points to win, and round 3 is worth 3 points to win, then it's hard to feel hopelessly behind since even after losing the first 2 rounds, you still tie if you win the third. This is a common tactic among, again, the Jackbox games, but also lots of game shows like Jeopardy or Family Feud. Now the biggest pitfall when using this method is failing to strike a good balance to where your final rounds are worth enough extra points to give the players falling behind the hope that they can catch up, but not worth so much that they effectively invalidate everything that's come before. One way to help with this issue is to avoid distributing each round's points in a winner-takes-all manner. That way you can have smaller multiples for later rounds due to the expectation that players shouldn't generally be getting totally blown out during the early rounds. Still though, it's a tough balance to strike. It's all too easy to end up with a final round that barely changes the standings, or one that is the only thing that matters in the whole game. Method 10. Just add more victory conditions. The last method we'll be discussing today is designing into your game multiple victory conditions. Civilization is a great example of this. If the domination victory was the only one which existed in the game, then it would end up becoming pretty obvious towards the end who was teed up to win, just due to the fact that whoever was currently winning that would obviously be the person who had conquered the most territory. And you got a similar situation if the only way to win is via winning the space race. However, By both victory conditions existing in the same game, it gives you an apples to oranges comparison that's more difficult to immediately determine who's winning it. A game where the central question towards the end is whether the player bent on conquest can subdue the last couple cities they need for victory before another player completes their space program is generally going to be more interesting than an endgame where one player enjoys a slight edge over their opponent scientifically as the two of them race for the same victory. Technically, you don't even need explicitly different victory conditions to achieve more or less the same effect. You can also just allow different means to achieve the same victory condition. In the card game Heart of Crown, one of the central questions you have to answer is when you will pivot from building your economy to scoring points. You can pivot earlier and try for a slow and steady approach to point accumulation, or you can spend more time building up your economy to hopefully gain points at a faster rate than those who pivoted earlier than you once you do pivot. This can provide a similar apples to oranges comparison between how well players are doing as separate victory conditions does. One thing to be aware of when using this method is it just flat out doesn't work if your game is not incredibly well balanced. If one victory condition proves to be obviously better to go for than the rest of them, then your game effectively is back to only having one victory condition. One way to avoid this is making victory conditions more difficult the more players are trying to achieve them. So in Civilization, if there are lots of players going for the domination victory, then that probably means the armies you'll be coming up against as you try to conquer the world will be stronger, thus making the domination victory take longer, and by extension making other types of victories more viable. This way your players' individual metas become somewhat self-correcting as players take advantage of underfilled niches in your game. So there you go, that's 10 methods you can use to make losing more palatable, and endings of your games more exciting and explosive. If you want to expand on or disagree with any of the methods, please do so in the comments below. Additionally, if you have any other methods that I neglected to mention, I would love to hear of those as well. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking it and subscribing to the channel. I've been doing more of these game design analyses as of late, so if you enjoyed this video, I'm sure there's more here that you'd be interested in checking out. But anyways guys, until next time, I have been SeamanCraft, and I will catch you in the next video. Goodbye.